What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Speaking Sessions podcast. I'm Philip Sessions, your public speaking and communications coach, and I have Robert Pardi here. He is possibilities in action. That is literally him if you would sum it up. But Robert is a personal growth retreat leader, keynote speaker, life coach, and author of Possibility in Action, A Pimby Tale, and Chasing Life. And there's a quote that I really like that I saw on his LinkedIn profile that says, possibilities exist all around us, but without action, they remain in the land of wishing, which is a really powerful quote. So, Robert, I want to go to that next, but first, tell us a little bit more about yourself. You have a very interesting background. You're not from Italy, but you live in Italy now, I believe, if I remember that correctly, from listening to you on another podcast. But yeah, tell us a little bit about your background and how you are, where you are, and got into the coaching space.
For sure. First, thanks very much for having me. So, you know, I'm a New Yorker, New York City born kid, ex-investment banker. So my career was completely different than it is now. Basically, the short version of my story is I grew up with an abusive alcoholic dad, which taught me a lot of life skills as a kid. Now, it's funny because it could have gone in either direction, but my grandmother was just absolutely amazing and, in a way, guided me. But that's when I first learned about taking action to change your life, uh, understanding, comparison, admiration, a lot of things which I couldn't define as a kid for sure, right? But there were those sort of lessons and resilience and grit. So I really, at a very young age, embraced action to find a way to freedom, which for me as a kid was money. I grew up in the Gordon Gekko, Wall Street, Ronald Reagan era. So it was
Yeah.
all about money, like in the 80s, right? So what happened very early on in my life is I met an amazing woman in university. We got married shortly after. She was 17, I was 19, so we got married very young, but basically at the height of our everything. I had just graduated from Columbia, got my MBA. She was excelling in the MD PhD program at Mount Sinai Hospital. She was diagnosed with late stage breast cancer
Mm.
as soon as I had taken a job in the Middle East. So that changed, of course, everything. And for 11 years, she journeyed with metastatic breast cancer. And that changed perspective. It taught us about the present moment, surrender. It taught us about purpose and doing your best and intention. There were so many lessons that were in that when she passed away and I went back to investment banking, it didn't feel right anymore. Because when I left my job to care for her, and it wasn't to care for her because she was completely self sufficient, she became the founding director of palliative care at New York Hospital with metastatic breast cancer. I mean, she was sort of like, she was a force. And I was there sitting in investment banking and realized what I missed was giving support. Like, I loved helping her achieve her dreams. So I just looked around at my life one day, understanding action, understanding impermanence, because I had just lived it, that life, from one breath to the next is completely changed. That I said, okay, what is an amazing story I would want to look back on? Because I believe that's at the end of the day, I'm a big intentional living guy. So at the end of the day, we get to craft that story. It's not adversity which crafts that story. We could find a way around that. So what did that lead me to? That led me to leaving my job, my investment banking job, and all that security, showing up in Italy because I always wanted to live in Italy. I showed up not speaking the language, not having a place to live, not having a job, and not knowing anyone because I was motivated by the challenge of rebuilding my life
Mm.
and chasing a new dream. And so that's what brought me to become a life coach because I had learned all those lessons. And one of the things that I learned with my wife, Desiree, her name was Desiree, was all of our experience has really no value if we don't share it with someone. That's where the true value comes from. And that's why I believe we're all content creators. The way we live, the experiences that we've had, the example we give to the world is content for people.
Yeah.
to follow or not follow whatever they decide to do with it. So I decided to become a life coach. And in all of that, I had a lot of people asking me to write the story about my wife. And I was like, yeah, I just really don't want to go down that road. And during the pandemic, I realized that everybody was suffering what she and I suffered during her journey. And that was uncertainty, that was identity shifts, fear, anxiety, aimlessness, all of these different things. And that's why I wrote the first book. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, it was a fountain and all these books came out. But,
Yeah.
uh, you know, so that's how I became a life coach. And that's sort of how the journey led me to where I am today.
Wow, that's and first of all, sorry for your loss, but it sounds like so many blessings came out of that, even with the tragedy of that. And actually makes me think of a client I was recently working with, and she had this speech she was giving on a million miracles was the theme for the whole church event that they were doing. And that's what we really talked about is that, hey, there's miracles in everything, both the good and bad. Oftentimes, when do people pray? It's when bad things are happening. They don't often pray when good things are happening. And it's the opposite for miracles. When great things are happening, you're like, oh man, this is great. This is a miracle. But even sometimes these bad things, they don't seem like a miracle in the moment. But just think about how many people you have been able to impact because of your wife, Desiree, and what y'all went through. And you actually can have that feeling and get that connection with the people that you coach and lead at these retreats and everything that you do. So it's just, there's a miracle there, even if it is sad in the moment.
Agree 100% with that. I speak a lot about I am beautifully scarred. Like my heart
Mm.
has a beautiful scar from having loved and cared for my wife.
Yeah.
The gift of all of that really, one, it brought us into a place of vulnerability and let us shed a lot of the unnecessary. But the idea of good and bad, one of the things that I learned in all of that is I wish my wife was here today. I mean, I miss her every single moment. It's a long, she passed away 13 years ago, but it still will always be with me.
Mhm.
But those are forces outside of our control. That's the whole Stoic belief. But if you move away from good or bad or happening to me and just sit in the space of what's next, how do I use this? How do I grow from this? What do I want to learn from this? Changes the dynamic. It doesn't take away the pain of having lost someone. And loss is so interesting in and of itself because loss at the end of the day, I'm an acronym guy. So loss at the end of the day for me is lack of self because we lose our identity and
Mhm.
security.
Mhm.
Everything seems unsafe now because something
Yeah.
happened outside of our control. For men, it could even be erectile dysfunction. That is then an impact on identity for
Yeah.
sure. And then everything feels unsafe because you're afraid to maybe be intimate with people. And so this idea of loss and grief is not compartmentalized to losing someone, but losing someone is really big. But at the end of the day, it's the questions, as I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, it
Mm.
doesn't say sit down, light a campfire, and roast marshmallows. It says walk through, right?
Yeah. Keep
And
going.
so keep going.
Yeah.
What happens at the end of that valley is there's a bend, and you don't know what's on the other side of that bend. And that's why the valley starts to feel comfortable for people because, like, well, I got my bearings here. You know what? It's the fear that's stopping me from stepping back in. That's why it's the reframing or asking those questions that become more empowering because this is our, now, whether it's reincarnation or whatever anyone else wants to talk about, this is our one time on this earth as who we are today. And so,
Mhm.
do we want to miss that opportunity? Or do we accept the loss of something and say, okay, this requires me to step up and rebuild? It's a mindset shift. It takes a while, it takes work. That's why coaching or even friendships or churches or whatever the case is, It's getting out of your head. This is not something you can study, which is why
Yeah.
possibility and action is so important. Action. No philosopher ever said, read these 1,000 self-help books. They said, hey, find what resonates with you and go live it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly. And we see, the prophets in the Bible that or Sadducees and Pharisees rather, that they read and they have all this knowledge and they have this box of scripture that they have memorized on their heads, and yet they know nothing. It's one thing when you have knowledge, but if you don't apply it through action, it means nothing. So you have to go apply that.
I love that call out because that uh, so many people don't see that. If you just think for a second, you can study
Hmm.
everything and you learn it. You can forget what you learned.
Hmm.
If you understand something, you can't forget that. That's
Yeah.
what action brings. Action
Yeah.
takes that learning to understanding. And then you can feel it when you step into a situation that doesn't feel right. Once you understand your values, you could do a values clarification. Oh, okay, I'm this. If you live them, then you know what? When you are in a situation that doesn't resonate with those values, you'll know.
Hmm.
And that is how you become intentional and conscious in your life. That's why action for me is such a big thing. It's not easy to take action. And action is not picking up and moving to Italy, by the way. So anyone listening, okay. And just for a point of clarification, so my wife did not have life insurance. She was very young when she passed away. There was a lot of debt after an 11-year journey with cancer,
Mm.
that it's not as if I had money that I could just, on the flip of a switch, show up in Italy. I was teaching English for $8 an hour as a Columbia MBA graduate because
Wow.
I needed to do that as an investment to build the new life I want, not a
Yeah.
sacrifice.
Yeah.
So that idea of action, the action is the mindset. That's the first thing. When you shift your mindset, as small as you want it to be, take that first small step and you build upon that. It's
Yeah.
not all of a sudden I'm changing my whole life. I just happen to do it that way because I'm sort of a little crazy when it comes to that aspect. I go big. I rather just go big
Yeah.
and fall hard. In, but that's my personality. So
Yeah, and definitely. And speaking of that, personality and just going and taking action, everything, and doing things different. One of the things that I've noticed with people when it comes to speaking is they feel like they need to be super prepared. They need to have like note cards. They need to have everything written down. And I'm not saying it's bad or good that way. Definitely think we need to have a happy medium between having nothing, perhaps, and having everything prepared before you go and speak on stage or speak in front of a group wherever you're speaking at. But when we're talking offline, we're very similar in the fact that we don't really prepare. I think we know what we want to talk about, but I want you to explain a little bit of that and why you decided to do that. And I think it really goes back into your story, how you just use your experiences. But tell us why you, as you told me offline, you have not ever written out a speech. You've just spoken from the heart.
yeah, thanks for asking that. And so my belief is that I am not speaking on stage to get
Hmm.
applause.
Hmm.
I am speaking on stage as a service to people. And so the idea for me of preparing a speech and memorizing it and getting everything blocked out, first of all, becomes very rigid. It becomes very cold.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily feel authentic. Second, I want to be able to have the flexibility to feel the room. As a speaker, even if it's 5 people or 500 people, you feel the room,
Yeah.
and you can gauge and be, let's say, a little more malleable in terms of what you want to say and how you want to deliver it. What I noticed is the more I would, because somehow I always wound up being in public speaking. It wasn't anything I ever thought about. My first job on Wall Street, I wound up becoming the HR director, which was not something I ever planned on doing, but I was really good with people. So they said, hey, will you take on this role? And I was involved in training. and I would, everything was just so strict because it's training. And then I start to learn about flexibility, because the more you try to memorize and block everything, the more pressure there is on you.
Mhm.
And so then if you skip a word, you skipped a word, and you're like, oh, wait, am I where I'm supposed to be? How much did I skip? You don't need that as a speaker. Everyone wants to have a TEDx talk. Everyone wants to do these other things. I'm here for you right now. I'm here for your speakers. I probably should be looking into the camera better than I do. I shouldn't be like moving all around. I should have better lighting. Is that really what public speaking is all about? Or
Mm.
is public speaking ensuring that I'm connecting with you and you can understand what I'm saying on an energetic, empathetic level, and not just on a theoretical level because I'm up there being so perfect? And
Yeah.
that's why I wing it more than anything else. Yes, I have that outline. I remember one of the first speeches I ever gave in Italy. There was a friend of mine, and she's Italian, and I said, "Well, I'm just going to wing it." She's like, "Well, what does that mean?" And so I explained it, right? And she's like, "Oh, that would terrify me."
Mm.
And I'm like, "If you're speaking from the heart, you can't make a mistake."
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's
and that's such a great point, and that's usually what happens with people I see when they over prepare or they have literally everything written out. It's one thing if you want to have some note cards so you can have your bullet points to remember. I don't think that's a problem, but if you literally have your whole speech and you've got it on your paper here and you're like, oh, where did I go? Oh, and you're losing yourself, like, oh, that's a rough spot to be in. You definitely want to speak more from the heart, and so this is definitely more of a speaking and your maybe it's like mindset stuff. It's not technical things that you're trying to give data and facts. That's a little bit different. But when we're
right.
talking about everyday speaking, but that's actually, I think about something I was talking with somebody yesterday about, and what they mentioned with communication is good communication has connection. And speaking is what we were talking about. Speaking, making sure you're looking in the camera. If you got a camera, looking at people's eyes, that you have the right lighting, that you sound good. But communicating with people is about making that connection. That's what we're talking about right now.
So well said. And something I found really interesting when I moved to Italy, because I didn't speak Italian.
Hmm.
And when I started learning Italian, I started to understand why immigrants stay together when they move to a city.
Hmm.
Because I was able to get my point across in Italian, but I wasn't able to express my personality yet.
Hmm.
And so it was easier to talk with people that spoke English because at least I was there.
Yeah.
That's part of, in my opinion, the whole public speaking thing is, and communicating, is it has to be you. Yeah, could I do the things where I deepen my voice a little bit and I'm a little more structured and so forth? Yeah, yes, I could, right? Um, I am then going against my own natural rhythm.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm not there for the accolades, but I am there for someone to see me, not see some, avatar of what I want them to see, but say, hey, this is me. This is how I act. I might drop the microphone. There was one speech I gave at a breast cancer conference, and I was supposed to stay behind the podium. I couldn't do it. And so
Yeah.
the microphone couldn't attach, and it was hysterical. But I was like, listen, everybody, I can't stand here and just speak to you this way. I want to connect with you.
Hmm.
Being behind here and you're only basically seeing my head and I got a spotlight on me seems absolutely ridiculous. We're talking about end of life. I
Yeah.
need to walk around. And that is just, as a speaker, this is what I think why a lot of people get very afraid about speaking in public, because they're trying to be something instead of just accept who they are on stage.
Yes.
And that's really all it is. That's the rest of it. Yeah, to try to not say or stutter, or that comes in time,
Hmm.
but I'm not sure if it's really, personally, I'm not sure if it's really that important. Will I be invited
Yeah.
to TEDx? I don't know, because I use a lot. It's okay. My life doesn't change. So,
Yeah. And I think the big thing with like the ums and the ahs, if you are repeating them 2 or 3 times every sentence, or it's every single sentence you're saying well, well, how about this? Well, okay, that's one thing. But if it's just here or there, we all do it in natural conversation.
yeah,
Nobody's sitting here. Oh, Robert, he had 15 ums in that podcast. Oh, he had 36 ums on that speech. Like, nobody's counting ums. That's all.
right,
Only the time that happens is in Toastmasters, and that's just to help you get better and realize and have that understanding that, hey, you are doing this. Let's work on it a little bit, because it can be distracting.
right.
But I always go back and say, if your message is powerful enough, people will listen to it. I don't know how many podcasts that I've listened to that had bad audio, but the message was still good. So I grinned and bared through that bad audio to listen to that message. And it's the same thing with the ums and ahs. If the message is good enough, if it's going to impact me and help me in some way, I'm going to listen, no matter how great or how bad you are as a speaker. Your message matters more than the way you speak and how eloquent you are with your speaking.
Well said. Well said.
So I want to do a little shift here, and I really think this kind of goes into it, because when we think of speaking, a lot of times we think about being on that stage, having that spotlight, having the microphone, being behind the podium, so everything's very polished. I
Yeah.
think this is why you are a retreat leader, because you don't have to be as polished. You can make better connections with everybody. So tell me a little bit about that. How did you get started with retreats? And I really want to dive into this, because I'm interested in doing some retreats myself in the future. So hopefully my audience is as well. But as I do networking events and stuff, which aren't retreats, but still something a little different than going and having an event where everybody's there for business or whatever it is. But how'd you get started with retreats?
Great question. So the retreats, they're actually a natural result of group coaching.
Hmm.
But part of, now this is very funny. I started thinking about retreats in 2000, the beginning of 2019.
Hmm.
I had hosted some people here where I live, but it wasn't necessarily a formal retreat. But it was a couple of days walking in the mountain. I live in a national park, so walking in the mountains and talking about life experiences. And I'm like, I really want to do this structured. So I made an investment in a tour company in Rome in
Mm.
September of 2019. February 2020, went to the United States to meet travel agents to basically sell the product. March 2020, Italy explodes with COVID. That company goes bankrupt. So then there was COVID, and I'm like, okay, well, what would I want a retreat to look like? If I walk away from needing a travel agency to help me with it, if I just developed it, what came to me was I want to discuss with people. I don't want to lecture. I don't want to uh, give, let's say, just my opinion,
Hmm.
because I truly believe, and sometimes this is taken the wrong way, unfortunately. I think it's very important that we are focusing on gender and race and sexual orientation, everything else for diversity. It's
Hmm.
a it's an important step. But true diversity is mindset. True diversity is being open to hearing conflicting opinions, which at the moment in the United States, there certainly is not that acceptance at all.
Yeah.
But so when I thought of the retreats, I wanted to have something that was an experience where people participated and we talked about, so purpose. This is my take on purpose. And we have a discussion about that. But because Italy played such an important part of my rebuilding my life, because when we step out of what's familiar to us, our perspective immediately opens. And we
Yeah.
were talking about this offline, right? I remember walking around Rome and seeing the ruins of one building incorporated into a modern structure. Well, isn't that life? You have a
Yeah.
loss, you have a tectonic shift in your life. There's rubble, but then you can incorporate that and you have something new. You're building a mosaic. So I started thinking, wow, Italy presents all these opportunities where the location actually represents a lesson. So the retreats that I host, they're all in Puglia at the moment. And one of the places we go to, for example, is a castle. It's supposedly where the Holy Grail was housed.
Oh, wow.
And we walk up to this castle, and then you're in this castle, and the Holy Grail is a metaphor for your life's purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is your purpose? What is your Holy Grail? Have you protected it with a castle? Do you value it? What are you going to do with it? When you're having that conversation in the location, there's a much bigger shift. It's almost getting to that I understand instead of I've learned it, right?
Yeah.
That's why there's part of that discussion. So that's how the retreats work. It's a 7-day retreat. I'm working on weekend retreats because there's a lot of Europeans that just want to come down, you know, from Germany or something like that for the weekend and work on some of this stuff. So that what brought me into retreats was trying to incorporate my entire journey, not just the coaching aspect of it, but the stepping out of my comfort zone and seeing new things and looking at them with a curious eye. And what does this mean for my life? You know, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you can create a metaphor for that, right? Like technically it's imperfect, but yet it draws a lot of people because it's so unique and yet it's resilient. You could have a million conversations about that at that location, and you're like, oh, I really see it. Or if you look at an ancient mosaic, you had to see some of them in the churches in Rome. Each individual piece was cut by hand, which means each is imperfect. But it's the imperfections that create the beauty and the depth, and we value that. Why can't we value that in ourselves? Why are we labeling things as imperfect when they're just character? So that's why the retreat has that structure and how I got into retreats. The retreat, I only host 8 people because I want it to be very intimate, but I've been a lot when I made the investment in the tour company. I saw a lot about retreats. You know, the size really doesn't matter. It's more what you want to bring to the table and what experience you want to walk somebody through. So for you to get into that space, there's so much you can bring to the table. And at the end of the day, what is it you want them to walk away with? Sorry. And so if you know what you want them to walk away with, reverse engineer it, which is exactly what you should do for your life, by the way.
Yeah.
Think about the story you want to live, and then reverse engineer it to today and start to put those pieces in place.
Nice. Well, let's dive into that. That's very interesting. So I want you to dive into that, how we can reverse engineer our lives to build the life that we truly want.
Oh, well, we could spend all day on that because that's my thing. That's all about intentional living, right? So, you know, we grow up with the idea of who do you want to be when you get older, right? And it's a job and it's a certain amount of money, and then we build around the job. What we need to understand, the reverse engineering, is what is the story? What is the lifestyle you want to live? You know, if you want to have, you know, a 10-bedroom house in the middle of, I don't know, Napa Valley or something like that, that's going to require a certain job and lifestyle. You have to understand, once you get in touch with your values and a story that seems interesting, when you reverse engineer it, you try to understand if your values are intact. And then you say, okay, what is a job where I'm passionate that could allow me this lifestyle? I talk all the time about right-sizing life. Here, New York City kid, ex-investment banker, MBA graduate from Columbia, I could have a nice amount of money. I decided to live in a town of 900 people where they're, you know, making the cheese and the pasta and the wine and the olive oil by hand. And I have a very simple life. I call that right-sizing my life because that supports the story. I love what I do, but I want something very harmonious. So I like to go hiking, and I like to spend 2 months, near the beach in the summer. And so what does that mean? It doesn't mean just taking a job that gives you money to do that, but it's ensuring that your energy, your time, because time is our most precious resource, right? It just
Mm.
it's not renewable.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's all going to something that makes you amplified.
Mm.
That's so the reverse engineering is to start, okay, this is what I think the story is I want to look back on. Testing that, validating that. Why is that way? What values does that support? Then starting to think about, okay, so if you're thinking about that, what do your days look like? How much time are you spending doing X, Y, and Z? And little by little, you then start to come up with a plan, and you say, hey, you know what? Yeah, this job where I'm working 70 hours a week, that's never going to get me where I want.
Yeah.
Then comes into the fear aspect, right? Because you are comfortable in that job. You have, a reputation now. You've got a stable income. It's good money. You have the house and whatever and so forth. And you're saying, okay, yeah, well, you know what? If I cut my salary in half to pursue this story, what's going to happen? And then you work through that as well. Like I think it's who is it? Is it Tim Ferriss maybe, that talks about taking your fears, thinking the worst case scenario, and then planning for that to happen, just so you could see that you actually have the resilience to deal with it. Like what I said when I moved here, like, well, worst thing in the world, I'll be a 45-year-old guy living with his mom. You know, that, and trust me, that would be like a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Because she's a little crazy. So, but it was the attempt to live this story. And that's where most people, when they start to move down that path and we work together, they realize, oh, wait a minute. It's not the end result of that story. It's actually being the explorer, the adventurer, the scientist, the craftsperson, whatever word you want to use, of my life.
Mm.
And that's where, because when you are that, just think about a sculptor, right? You take a block of marble. It's not you hit it once and the statue pops out and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, how beautiful, right? You have to chip away at it, intentionally hit certain spots. That's the reverse engineering. What do I want this sculpture to look like? Where do I have
Yeah.
to start chipping away? Unnecessary, necessary, essential. You start piecing it all together, but you find the joy in the chipping away,
Yeah.
not that end product, which halfway down the line, you might say, you know what? I really thought I was going to make a statue of I don't know, David, and now I want to create a pig.
Yeah.
So it's flexible. That's why that end result, and we've learned that, especially in America. You work X amount of years, you'll get to retirement, you have all the money in the bank, and then you can take time off and you can travel and you can breathe and you can relax. And we don't know if that's even going to happen, but why would you delay that? What can
Yeah.
you build into your life today? And is that the story you want to really live? You know, um, there are blue zones all around the world. One of them is in Okinawa, and the blue zones are where there's people that live more than 100 years old.
Mm.
And there's a large population in Okinawa, and they actually don't have the word retirement in their language. Because why would you retire from life?
Mm.
You should find out what that passion is. It's called ikigai. And that is what sustains you throughout the whole journey. So I don't know if I
Yeah.
clearly answered your
No.
question, because I could go in a million different directions, but that's pretty much what it is. You have to be willing to make the investments, not the sacrifices.
Hmm.
Like when my wife and I had no money, I can tell you I ate a hot dog every night for almost a year, because that's what you do.
Yeah.
That was not a sacrifice because we were building something. It was an investment. So same thing. If you have to cut down on Starbucks, or if you can't stay in a 5-star hotel, you know what? If you figured out your values, it will be more rewarding to stay in a 3-star and know you're building something than stay in a 5-star and just not be going where you want to go.
Yeah.
Or it could be the other way around. So
Hmm. Yeah, I like it. I appreciate you sharing that. Two things I kind of took from that is one, you really start enjoying the process rather than trying to get to that end goal, which, as you explained, really there isn't an end goal if you set it up right. And then two, I was thinking about this, and I feel like I've heard it somewhere as well, that when you really put into perspective what you truly want, you realize that you don't need as much money as you think to be able to do that. Oftentimes, especially for us in the States here, we want this and we want that. And we want all these things. And that's why we need money. But if you think about, can I be that family man or that family woman? Like, is that the legacy that I'm going to leave behind? That Philip was this family man, or if you, whoever was this person that was a stand-up person, lived with integrity, always gave the shirt off their back, did everything they could, that doesn't take a lot of money. It really doesn't. And most of the time when you're a giver, it's not about giving of money, it's about giving of time, giving of maybe mental energy, just mentorship, whatever it is. So you don't even need all that money. So you don't need that job that pays you six figures or seven figures or however much money you think you need, because you have that purpose in mind.
again, well said. And for sure, for some people, money is the thing, because
Yeah.
for money for them, like when I was a kid, money somehow represented freedoms, represented safety. My wife passes away. I realized, money didn't really do anything, and
Yeah.
couldn't save her. There was no safety. The money was gone at the end anyway. But regardless of whatever path someone chooses, you need to understand if it's conscious. There's a really interesting study that they showed, and this is based on happiness, not on joy, but above like $110,000, any more money does not create any more sense of happiness. There's
Hmm.
only so many things you can buy, and so forth. But what you were just talking about is what I talk about. I run workshops. So one of the workshops is essential living, is really what's essential to your life.
Yeah.
And I just came out of this Buddhist retreat because I'm curious about all this stuff. And literally, you were given a bowl of oatmeal at 6:30 in the morning, and then at 11, because you wake up at 4, then at 11 you had lunch, which was basically rice and beans and vegetables, and that was the only meal. Those were the only two meals. Then it was
Oh.
18 hours of fasting, and a lot of people do this intermittent fasting for health or whatever.
Hmm.
And the first couple of days, I was like, oh, wow, I wonder if I'm going to be able to do this. I mean, like these two small meals a day. And then all of a sudden, I realized, you know what? My body is working perfectly fine. And it gave me some insight into another aspect of essential living, in
Hmm.
terms of, the first day when they tell you your meals are going to be like tiny, you grab a plate of lunch like this, right? It's a big mountain. You're like, well, I also have to eat dinner at the same time.
Yeah.
So, and then I started looking at things, and I'm like, hey, you know what? Yeah, maybe I don't need as much. Same experience I had when I was in India. My wife and I came back after India, and we donated a lot of our stuff because it was, yeah, we don't, these things don't contribute to the serenity inside.
Yeah.
They are a representation of the effort I'm putting in for work, and they're my, let's say, rewards, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
But when you're in a space of passion and purpose, you might not necessarily need that, 65-inch TV.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, there are many different aspects of that. But for some people, yes, the money and the homes and so forth are the important thing, or their ability to donate. So again, it's just being conscious in that and making those decisions for you, because there is no other Philip. And even though you and I are, I joke about this, but I truly believe it. You and I are on the same planet, but we don't live in the same world,
Hmm.
because your dreams, your worries, your fears, your experiences, your perspective is different than mine.
Yeah.
So your life is yours. It's your one life to live consciously, intentionally, and to try to find out what that my belief is that we should try to find out what that means. And that goes for, spirituality and religion and sexuality and all these other things, that these are our choices. We're gifted as human beings to have the capacity to choose.
Mm.
And are we following a linear path that was just explained to us? One of the most interesting things for me, when you think about the way we work, the 5-hour work week was created by Henry Ford because he had the financial capability to give two people 2 days off to his workers, so he could hire the best workers to create the Model Ford, the Model T.
Mm.
So these things that we believe are normal, a lot of times they were designed for an objective which is not the objective that is inside for us. And I always reflect on that, thinking about, for some people, maybe they want to work 7, for some people, maybe they want to work 3, but the standards that are in place were never written, on some tablet somewhere that someone
Yeah.
found. They were engineered for efficiency. I don't like to think that that's what I want my life to be, that I'm the cog in, some mechanism. I'd rather create the mechanism.
Yeah, man, that's so true. And that's the beauty that I love about entrepreneurship. The 9 to 5, you're stuck in that, especially in the States, it's 8 hours, 40 hours a week. Obviously, other parts of the country, it's a little bit different, but they still have a set amount of time. That's a standard for that. Where entrepreneurship, you can have weeks where maybe you're only working 5 hours, and others you may be working 80, but you get to decide, and there's no standard there. And that's, like I said, the beauty of entrepreneurship. And that's the beauty of life. You get to decide how much time you put in to anything. And typically, the time you put in and how much time you put in means you prioritize that more. So if you're putting very little time into your family and you put a lot of time into work, you probably prioritize work, and that's more important to you than family. Now, this is when we're talking about outside of the scope of what you have to work to be able to feed your family, to
Yeah.
sustain the essentials. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about literally, because if we think about it, like I think about with my daughter, I spend more time at work than I do with her, unfortunately, but I have to make a living. So there is that dynamic you have to think about there. But
Yeah.
just think about that for those of y'all listening right now. How much time are you putting in? Are you reverse engineering your life? There's so many things that have been brought up here. But Robert, I want you to leave us with one last message. I know we talked about tons of things, but if there's one thing you can leave us with, what is that message that you want to leave us with?
You know what? I'm going to leave you with a message that I learned with my wife. And it is that we can only live an extraordinary life when we value the ordinary moments.
Mm.
It's those things that are happening every day. It really is. Like, wake up to them, be aware of them, embrace them, give thanks for them, because that's where life is taking place. That holding the hand of somebody you love and walking on, a boardwalk somewhere, make sure you're present, because that is a gift. That is beautiful. And if that's not there, you definitely will miss it. But be present in that moment. Don't think about, the next email that has to be answered or something like that. Just work on that. It's those ordinary moments that bring us all the joy in the world.
Man, and there's a lot more ordinary moments that happen than extraordinary.
For sure.
So we focus on the ordinary. That's the life worth living for
Abundance.
sure.
That's abundance.
I love it. Well, Robert, and I appreciate you coming on, sharing all of these words of wisdom, essentially, all these life lessons for us. If people want to follow you, get to know you more, and maybe even go to your retreat, which I looked on your website, it looks phenomenal. So where can they go? What's the best place for them to go to get to know you and get in touch with you?
Best place is my website, Robert Pardi, PARDI.com, and everything's right there.
All right, sounds great. Well, Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you, Philip.